Привет всем забугорным, I'm Russian and I'll tell my tales from the Russian point of view because we also want to be heard. And this video was supposed to be out months ago, but what can I say? Life happens and university doesn't really care that you have a YouTube channel. So yeah, but anyway, the problem still stands. I know that The Great is not the most historically accurate show, but you'd think they'd at least try to keep the genealogy straight. To be fair, I don't blame them for failing because Romanov's 18th century genealogy is a big mess with a subtitle, How to Ruin Your Dynasty, Part 2. And in case you're wondering, Part 1 was in the early 17th century, and let's just say there is a reason why it's titled The Time of Troubles. Anyway, coming back to The Great and 18th century lineage, not only it's an extremely tangled mess, but for some inexplicable reason, despite having the widest list of names beforehand, literally everyone involved decided to stick with the same 5 names. I'm not even kidding, you'll see. This is why I decided to keep as little names as possible so you wouldn't mix anyone up. And don't worry, I plan on making other historical videos that will go into more details on different events mentioned here. Treat this video as a starting point so you could understand what kind of mess is ahead of you. But if you're here for a very quick recap, skip to the time that should appear on screen. Others, please welcome to the second messiest time of Russian history. Now, to start untangling this mess, we need to go back to Peter I, who will later be known as Peter the Great, and his older brother Ivan V. You see, the boys had to rule together. Their father had 16 children, and you'd think that with this amount of heirs, his dynasty was secure. But his sons from the first marriage were all very weak, dying one by one, leaving only 15-year-old Ivan, whose health was also far from the greatest. On the other hand, little Peter, the only son from the second marriage, was strong, healthy, and very smart. This led to a power struggle between the relatives of 2 mothers, since they both came from very influential families. As sort of a peace treaty, it was decided to make both boys rulers. They even had a special throne with 2 seats. To make a very long and complicated story short, Ivan dies at the age of 29, very sick, but not childless. But for now, we will concentrate on Peter. At the age of 16, he was married off to Evdokia Labukhina, and at first that marriage wasn't all that bad. But Peter didn't like the old ways of Russia and wanted to reform the country to make it more European. As we say today, to cut the window into Europe. Mind you, he wasn't the first Tsar who wanted that, but he definitely was the most radical. He renamed Rus into Russia and proclaimed himself to be an emperor, something that I want you to remember, as there was not a single Tsar after him. Meanwhile, as strange as it may sound, his wife did not support this idea of modernization and preferred life the old-fashioned way. So they separated, and after a long line of mistresses, Peter finally meets Marta Skhavronskaya, who becomes his lifelong partner in all the crazy antics. Marta was later baptized into Orthodox Christianity to be named Ekaterina, as she was an Orthodox, Russian, or even noble. In order to marry now Ekaterina, Peter forcefully made his first wife to become a nun and locked her in a monastery, something that neither Russian aristocracy nor their son appreciated. And speaking of their son, Alexei, he was raised in a more traditional Russian manner and, as such, also did not support his father's reforms. Peter really didn't care much about his son, but he did try to involve him into the governing process. However, he stopped doing that after his second wife, remember Ekaterina, gave birth to the baby boy. Alexei became truly unwanted, and Peter started to pressure him to become a monk, just like he did with his mother, which the young man obviously didn't want. So, Alexei does the unthinkable and runs away into Europe, which, according to the law, was considered to be a treason. Now, what happened next was pretty much a spy movie with a lot of court intrigue, so, cutting to the chase, Alexei was returned back to Russia, where he was imprisoned and tortured. Peter wanted to know if his son wanted to start a coup against him. Alexei denied everything and would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for the woman he loved. She was either bribed or threatened, but whatever the case, she told everything about Alexei's plan to overthrow his father, with the help of Austria, of course. So Alexei was pronounced guilty and was supposed to be executed, but he didn't live long enough for that. Officially, he died from a stroke, but already in the 19th century, it was discovered that he was tortured to death. Some think that Peter himself killed his son, since he did admit that Alexei died in his presence, though historians still debate about the emperor's direct involvement. But regardless, what we need to know is that Alexei didn't die childless. He had a son named Petr Alexeyevich, and, according to the Russian law, he was supposed to become the next ruler after the death of his grandfather. Peter III, however, didn't want that to happen, and instead prepared his other son from the new wife, who was also named Peter by the way, to become the next emperor. In order to do that, in 1722, he passed the law that allowed the ruling monarch to appoint as their successor anyone they see fit. Unbeknownst to himself, Peter I screwed Russia big time with this law, because his beloved little son died soon after, and since Peter killed his older son and never allowed his sisters to marry, the dynasty was left without a direct heir. On his own deathbed, the first emperor of Russia said, "Leave everything to," and died before giving the name. The lack of a proper heir and the aforementioned law gave ground to what later will be known as the era of palace coups. While Peter was still slowly dying in agony, the Senate that he himself created was already deciding who should take the not yet empty throne. The old Russian aristocracy wanted Peter's grandson to take the throne. The new aristocracy, brought to power by Peter himself, was involved in the trial of his older son, Alexei. They feared that his son will seek revenge. They wanted to appoint Catherine, Peter's second wife, as the new ruler. The position was given to Catherine an hour before the death of her husband. As once a peasant woman, she could barely write. Even today, people laugh at her for making 4 mistakes in a 3-letter word. But she knew how to write her own signature, and that was enough. She became Empress Catherine I, aka the reason why Catherine the Great is called Catherine II. But she spent her ruling times partying and even died from overeating. The real power was in the hands of the so-called Supreme Privy Council, and no, I have no idea why it's translated this way into English. But, oh well, who am I to go against Wikipedia? Officially created to help Catherine understand the government process, in reality they were the ones ruling the country. The head of the council tricked Catherine into appointing Peter's grandson as a new ruler, with his own daughter as his wife, of course. As such, the boy whose own grandfather couldn't bear to see him on the throne became the next emperor, titled Peter II. If I were to describe him in a word, I'd say unloved. His grandfather didn't love his father, his parents didn't love each other, and both of them didn't love their son. The only person who cared about him was his older sister, but she was already sick with consumption and died soon after he became an emperor. Everyone else saw him as a pawn in their own game. He became an emperor at the age of 12 and, as you can imagine, cared little about the country. By all laws of logic, Russia was supposed to crumble down, but the changes that Peter I set in motion somehow kept pushing the country forward. The members of the Privy Council were all too happy to distract Peter from their own affairs. They even persuaded the young royal to move the capital back to Moscow, convincing him that the local forests are much better suited for the hunting, something that Peter II was obsessed with. This change was part of a plan to bring Russia back to its pre-imperial status quo. Somewhere in the process of this everlasting party, Peter fell in love with his own aunt, Elizaveta, or Aunt Betty as she's called in the grade. She was only 6 years older than Peter and considered to be extremely beautiful. While such a close marriage wasn't common for Russia at the time, it did have many supporters, as it would nicely tie down the loose ends of the dynasty. The members of the Privy Council were against, though. Many of them wanted to marry the emperor off to someone from their own families. Peter having an existing fiancé was never really an issue. The last family to succeed was Dolgorukovi. Now, I promised I wouldn't give you many names, but these people would play quite a crucial role in the future. Now, to get Peter's approval to the marriage, he was given a proof that his beloved aunt is in love with another man, and to make sure the emperor won't change his mind, the Dolgorukov family made sure a 14-year-old boy drinks and parties every day non-stop. This is why, when he contracted smallpox, his body was too weak to recover. While the young boy was dying in the palace that was still decorated for his own wedding, the Dolgorukov family was desperately trying to come up with a plan that would help them keep the power. Their last attempt was to make the emperor sign a will in which he transferred his power to his fiancée. Remember that under the law of Peter I, it was completely legal and would mean that Russia would change the dynasty. But Peter II came back to consciousness only for a moment. He said, "Prepare the horses, I'm going to visit my sister Natalia." She was long dead by that time, and a few moments later, so was he. Peter II never married and never had children, so obviously he can't be the father of Peter III. And, if you're wondering, the Dolgorukov family forged the emperor's signature, but nobody was tricked by their bluff. However, despite the fact that the Dolgorukovs did not become the new dynasty of Russia, the Romanov dynasty also died. Peter II was the last direct male descendant on the throne. All the rulers who'd come from the female heirs would technically carry their father's last names. But no time to grieve. It's time to look for a new ruler. If you remember, Catherine I appointed Peter II as her successor, but she also added that if something happens to the boy, the next in line would be her daughter Anna with her descendants, and then Elizaveta with hers. Anna, unfortunately, was dead by that time, but she had a 2-year-old son, Karl Petr Ulrich. Had the Supreme Privy Council followed this will, Russian history would have been very different, but they still wanted power. As such, they decided to go way back. Remember that Peter I ruled with his brother Ivan, and that despite dying at a young age, he wasn't childless. Well, he had 3 daughters. The oldest was Ekaterina Ivanovna, but she was soon rejected. The council feared that her husband and his German relatives would intervene in the politics. Besides, Ekaterina herself was deemed too independent and strong-willed. As such, the middle daughter, Anna Ivanovna, was chosen. She was married to a Latvian duke, but her husband died 2 months after the wedding. Peter I pretty much drank him to death. And I know what you're thinking. Russians, vodka, drinking. But no, Peter was a giant of 2 meters and 3 centimeters. It's this much feet according to Google. And he was as healthy as a young bull.
He could drink a lot and would force Russian aristocrats to do the same, many of whom died of an alcohol poisoning. He even killed his daughter's fiancé this way. People were literally afraid of him. So, no, it's not Russians, it's Peter I. Anyway, Anna Ivanovna was forced to stay in Latvia by Peter I, obviously, where she lived in very poor conditions. She could barely afford to warm the place, and all the furniture in the estate was bought with her own money because it was all stolen during the previous war. Basically, the Supreme Privy Council believed that Anna Ivanovna would be so happy about this opportunity to get away that she'd agreed to all conditions. And oh boy, some conditions they had. Basically, the only thing she could do was choose how to spend her pocket money and command the palace guards. That's it. She wasn't even allowed to get married. And, of course, Anna Ivanovna signed everything and rushed to Moscow. But, upon entering the city, she was met by officers from Preobrazhensky regiment. From them, she found out that Moscow aristocracy did not support the conditions she signed, as that meant transfer of power from a monarch to a small group of people. So, Anna Ivanovna understood that she might possess more power than she was led to believe, and, upon gathering her court, ripped the conditions in two, thus becoming an empress in full right. And the Supreme Privy Council was, of course, dissolved. Historians still disagree about the outcome of Anna Ivanovna's rule. On one hand, we have a growing economy, important reforms in the army and fleet, flourishing of arts, improvement in the situation with the higher education, development of printing press even. Police stations in many provincial towns first appeared thanks to her regulations. On the other hand, Anna didn't really give out all those orders herself. She preferred to party just like so many people on the throne before her, but she reached an unprecedented level of extravaganza. The most famous example of her crazy antics was the wedding in the Ice House, a special ice palace with fountains that had burning petrol for water. All of that to marry a 53-year-old ex-noble who was stripped of his status and made a jester at Anna's court, and a 20-year-old Kalmyk girl who had a misfortune of mentioning that she was lonely. The soon-to-be newlyweds were paraded around the city in a cage mounted atop of an elephant, and a queue of masqueraded performers followed them. After the ceremony, the two newlyweds were forced to spend the entire night on a bed of ice, while others were looking at them as if they were monkeys in a zoo. They didn't have to do anything censorship-worthy as far as I'm aware, but it's not that it made the situation any nicer. Anna Ivanovna was also extremely paranoid. The wrong gesture could send you to... no, not to Siberia, Kamchatka. It is believed that during her 10-year reign, 20,000 people were tortured and imprisoned. She didn't trust anyone in the Russian court. The Empress even decided to move the court back to St. Petersburg to be further away from the influence of the old Russian aristocracy, and instead relied on foreigners who were less active in the events with previous rulers. Especially close with her was one named Ernst Biron, whom she met back in Latvia. He was considered to be Empress's favourite, and it was even believed that the mother of Biron's youngest son was not his official wife, but Empress herself. After all, when Anna Ivanovna received the news of her coronation and rushed to the capital, she took an 18-month-old baby boy with her, though many historians now believe that their relationship was exaggerated. They think that Biron was just Empress's good friend, This is why she never ordered Biron to divorce his wife. She might have lived vicariously through them and their much happier family. But whatever the case, Else Biron was rumoured to have so much power over the Empress that her rule was actually sarcastically nicknamed Bironovshina. Anyway, Anna Ivanovna was 37 when she ascended the throne, so she never expected to remarry and start a new bloodline. But the throne did need an heir, so she decided to bring to Russia the daughter of her older sister Ekaterina. Remember? Ekaterina was considered for the role of an empress, but was ultimately rejected. The girl was baptized and received the name Anna Leopoldovna. Now, she wasn't supposed to inherit the throne, but rather her future child. So, when young Anna turned 20, she was married off to a German duke. Of course, Anna Leopoldovna didn't like her husband, but she couldn't go against the order of her royal aunt. Soon after, she gave birth to a baby boy. The entire country breathed out with ease. Finally, the dynasty is restored. But the universe only had a sarcastic "ha." When Anna Ivanovna died, Anna Leopoldovna became a regent in the name of her firstborn. She was technically married, but realistically her husband didn't play any role in the court. Anyway, the universe's sarcastic laugh reached the new empress a year later, when Elizaveta Petrovna, remember, Aunt Betty, for those who are still lost, staged a coup. Young empress treated Elizaveta as her sister, and despite the fact that she was very well aware of the upcoming revolution, refused to believe that her beloved sister would do something like that. Elizaveta, meanwhile, did not share Anna's feelings. During the reign of Anna Ivanovna, she was shunned away from the centre of attention out of the fear that she would want to revolt against the empress and bring back Peter's dynasty back to the throne. For the same reason, Anna Ivanovna did not allow Elizaveta to marry, even though she kept receiving proposals. And all that boiling frustration led to a coup. Elizaveta has become something of an idol to the army, Russian princess among foreign lackeys of an inept empress. As a result of a revolution, Anna Leopoldovna, her husband, and most of her children were sent into the northern province of Russia, away from the royal capital. Her oldest son, named Ivan VI, was imprisoned. But, unlike what they show in The Great, Elizaveta never attempted to kill the baby boy. She kept him safe in case she'll need to use him as a pawn in this crazy game of royal chess. The new empress didn't want to share her newly acquired power with anyone. She made sure that no one of her advisors gained too much importance. She had a mission to complete. She wanted to continue her father's, Peter I, legacy and made sure to follow his reforms. Elizaveta also followed the example of her predecessors in that she loved to party. The new empress was very beautiful, the fact that she was very well aware of. She never wore the same outfit twice, and by the time of her death had about 1,500 dresses. No one was allowed to outshine the empress. For example, there was a moment when one of her court ladies had a hairdo decorated with roses that Elizaveta deemed prettier than hers. So she took the scissors and cut out the flower together with the strands of the woman's hair, and then whipped the poor girl's cheeks with the aforementioned rose. Yeah, Aunt Betty wasn't the kind of woman you can slap and get away with it. Now, historians also disagree about the results of Elizaveta's reign. It was her rule that allowed for the rise of industry and the opening of the first bank. Russian army reached Berlin. If it hadn't been for the death of the Empress, a big piece of Germany would have become a Russian province. On the other hand, Elizabethan time in Russia saw the rise of unprecedented corruption, and the power of aristocracy reached its peak. What can I say? It's not hard to learn history, but it's hard to judge its outcome. It's also important to mention that after witnessing the entire era of palace coups herself, Elizaveta was endlessly paranoid about someone else overthrowing her. She never slept in the same room. Her palace was always under construction. It would have new windows and doors, the ladders that were constantly relocated, or to confuse the possible revolutionaries. As for her successor, well, if you remember the will of Catherine I, she appointed her oldest daughter and her descendant as the new heirs to the throne. And, as I said, Anna Petrovna was already dead by that time, but had a son, Karl Petr Ulrich, and Elizaveta chose him to be the next emperor. The boy was brought to Russia and received the name of Peter III. The thing is, I truly believe that Peter could have had a better life. Despite what the show tells you, Peter's parents were a rare example of an arranged royal couple falling in love, so he could have been raised in a loving family, but they both died. Or, had Peter been brought to Russia right after the death of Peter II, as a 2-year-old, he would have grown up to be a real Russian prince, and no one would accuse him of being too Swedish. I don't even think that he would have developed the fascination with Friedrich II. From what I read, I think Peter liked him simply because Friedrich showed him the bare minimum of respect that the boy so desired. I don't think he would have needed that if the Russian court saw him as the future emperor right away. He may not have married Catherine as well, since it was Elizaveta who chose her as his wife. Since Peter III was before her in the line of succession, Elizaveta Petrovna would truly be simply Aunt Betty. And to recap, Anna Petrovna was Peter's mother, but she died almost right after giving birth to him, and never was his predecessor on the Russian throne. He also has never done anything inappropriate with her dead body. Peter II was never Peter III's father, as logical as it may sound. It was Karl Friedrich von Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp has the reason for this complicated name. Peter II was his mother's half-nephew. They obviously were never married, but he did want to marry Elizaveta Petrovna, Aunt Betty of this show. It didn't work out. What did work out is Elizaveta becoming an empress. In order to do so, she needed to imprison Ivan VI, who wasn't Peter III's half-brother. Instead, Peter's grandfather, Peter I, and Ivan's great-grandfather, Ivan V, were half-brothers. Most other people did not exist. Well, you know the rest. Peter III married Catherine II, later known as Catherine the Great. It was her, by the way, who killed poor Ivan, not Elizaveta. She is also believed to have killed Peter and brainwashed her own grandson to kill his father. Her own son, by the way. Oh well, I guess she wouldn't look as cool if she went around killing Romanovs left and right. Well, I think that's enough for today. Hope I managed to explain at least a little bit that is the mess, that is the era of the palace coups. Subscribe if you want to know more about Russia and Russian history. Thanks for listening. Пока-пока.